I'll just start. Okay, welcome to today's seminar. Today we are welcoming here the speaker, Dr. Cormac Walsh from the University of Oldenburg in Germany. And yeah, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to the opportunity to speak about my research. I'm a social scientist, as you can maybe gather from the title as well. I am a geographer by training. I'm interested in governance issues around protected area management. It has been mostly at the Wadden Sea in Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark, examining issues of nature-society relations, governance, policy analysis. And really here I'm beginning to look at Donana as a comparative case, particularly as a key site for migratory birds as well along the East Atlantic Flyway, and to extend the perspective beyond the Wadden Sea. In particular, I'm trying to better understand wetlands conservation issues in the Anthropocene. So what does it mean to have a World Natural Heritage Site in the context of current global anthropogenic pressures? How do we understand nature in this context? And of course, there has been some key literature, both from a social science perspective, and I think increasingly from the natural sciences as well, on global ecology, about the risks to migration in general, bird migration, and this idea that now that we live also in a multinatural world, not just multinational, but also multinatural, that we have a plurality, a diversity of very different perspectives on nature. So here Jamie Lorimer talks about conservation after nature. This idea that we don't have one single universal idea anymore of what nature is, but we need to understand it in its current context of global environmental change as well. With protected areas, we're still place-based mediums continue to be very important, but in an interconnected global context. Maybe I should not stand on the cable. Okay, very good. We also know from the history of national parks, and environmental historians have done a lot of work on this, that there are many different ideas worldwide about what a national park is and should be. We have the Yosemite model maybe, but there are also very different ideas, whether it's in Germany, in Ireland, where I'm from originally, in Spain, about what a national park does. Does it protect national nature in some way? Is it about iconic scenic landscapes? Is it about nature that is globally important? So these are some of the questions that I'm interested in my research. For me, a starting point is to try to think about what are national parks or protected areas as organizations, and in some ways it seems that they have two faces. So they are Janus-faced, but it's partly about science-informed conservation, which of course is a key aspect and often the initial starting point for conservation initiatives, but not always, whether it's about species, ecosystems, landscapes, and this has changed of course very much over time as well. But there's also a public face, and this is often about presenting nature in particular places as attractive to visitors, and that can be really important in terms of how national parks or protected areas understand themselves as well. But this means, of course, that there can be a tension between the public understanding of nature, also the official narratives, the policy narratives, and the scientific discourse of ecological or biological conservation. So on the one side, you have conservation management informed by the natural sciences, which tends to be international in scope, with a strong empirical focus on data, monitoring, regulations. In theory about objective natural values, but I'm not sure if that's always the case. On the other side, public engagement, which is informed by and really shapes as well public understandings of nature. So national parks as key public institutions, they also shape how people in society understand what nature is. They are more open to multiple types of knowledge, including local, place-based knowledge. There's a focus on the local qualities of individual places and perceived or relational nature values as well. So two quite different discourses or narratives here. What I have found in my research as well is, a lot of it is about this question of what we might call conservation ideology. So these are the values, the ideas, concepts that inform conservation in practice as well. And I think the key aspect here is that often we think that conservation is applied science, and I would argue no, that's not the case. That's only part of the picture, that also a range of societal values and perspectives inform conservation in practice as well, and that from a scientific perspective we need to engage much more with these aspects that inform what happens in practice in conservation. So I'll explain more about what this means in concrete terms in relation to the Wadden Sea as well, and what I think it might mean to a more limited extent in the case of Donana also. So maybe you know the Wadden Sea is a transboundary conservation site, a World Heritage site, initially the German and Dutch coast in 2009, and then expanded in 2014 to include Denmark. There are multiple different national parks, because, for example, in Germany, national parks, although they are called national parks, it is not a federal competence, but from the federal states. So there's one in Lower Saxony, one in Schleswig-Holstein, a smaller one in Hamburg as well. So 3 different national parks. In the Netherlands, there are only very, very small national parks, so on the island of Schiermonnikoog, for example. In Denmark, there is one national park, the Wadden Sea, but they all have very different approaches institutionally, organizationally, in terms of resources as well, and different ideas about participation. Currently, what is interesting from I think from the Donana perspective also, is that the Wadden Sea is under increasing scrutiny from UNESCO, partly because the conservation NGOs at the Wadden Sea contacted UNESCO and said, we are really concerned about what is happening here, whether it's about oil and gas extraction in the North Sea, close to the World Heritage Site boundary, for example. Also the future impacts of offshore wind, which is part of an increasingly industrializing southern North Sea as well. In the past, we also have really massive human intervention at this coast due to a 1,000-year history of dike building and land reclamation. We also have very significant pressures due to nutrient input, due to fisheries, for example, and of course due to climate change as well, which is leading to higher sea levels and the risk that the intertidal mudflats essentially will be drowned over time. And of course here the key aspect is that the dike line acts as an artificial boundary preventing the ecosystem from migrating inland, which would have been the case without this boundary. So it's really these two issues combined here means that the Wadden Sea, even though it's recognized internationally, I think, as international good practice in many cases, there are really very significant anthropogenic pressures as well today and in the future. At the Wadden Sea, of course, the three countries need to agree. So it's a very complex governance landscape. And what they have agreed on is a guiding principle from 1991, which is essentially around achieving as far as possible a natural and sustainable ecosystem in which natural processes proceed in an undisturbed way. The key emphasis here is on natural processes and undisturbed nature. This is interpreted in slightly different ways, I would say, in the three countries. But this is also very much behind the criteria for the outstanding universal value for the World Heritage Site designation as well. In Germany, there's a strong focus, I would say, an ideological focus on letting nature be nature and on wilderness. So let's say hands-off conservation with limiting human inputs and not really setting goals for nature otherwise. Whereas in Denmark and the Netherlands, you could say a more pragmatic focus, more attention to combining ecological and social values, more participation as well in decision making from various stakeholders. So in my research, what I've been told by conservationists, for example, is that, it's much easier to objectify nature conservation goals when I don't have to make them arbitrarily. I let nature decide. So this is this perspective of letting nature be nature. We don't set the goals. We just establish a national park, and then we allow natural dynamics to take place. And of course, I was very much interested in what does this actually mean in practice? How do you know you have been successful? And we have ongoing research projects at the moment trying to measure or in some way assess naturalness in relation to sediment dynamics at the Wadden Sea. I was told by a director of one of the visitor centers at the German Wadden Sea coast that nature conservation is not a science, it is ideology. I was really surprised that he said this. And this was essentially, he was saying that, it's changed so many times in the last 10, 20 years about which species we should protect, which are the good species, which are not. That legally he saw it as almost arbitrary, that it's really there's so much behind it that is not only science, but also that the policies shift, that it's, what counts as an invasive species, what are the actual objectives for a particular area. So it became clear that it's not simply about letting nature be nature. There are much more, at a detail level, there's much more behind it than that. So it's, these types of aspects inspired my research and asking, okay, what type of nature is protected? Is it about ecosystems, landscape, natural processes, and what this means and how it all fits together? So essentially, some of the issues that I and colleagues have looked at are around protected area hinterland relations, so the relationship between the protected area itself and the wider region. These questions around naturalness and wilderness. What does wilderness mean in this context? How is it understood? About landscape narratives and perceptions, and more recently about the role of migratory birds in this context, particularly their role in how nature at the Wadden Sea is understood. I will say a little bit more about that as well. But yeah, so for example, in relation to the relationship between the protected area and the hinterland, at the Wadden Sea, of course, we have this very stark boundary between an open, fluid, dynamic landscape outside the dikes, and then a very structured, cultivated landscape of straight lines behind the dikes. In Denmark, they decided, though, to include some inhabited areas within the national park and the coastal marshlands as well, whereas in Germany, it was a very, very strict separation between this is nature, this is the natural landscape, and this is the cultural landscape then behind the dikes. Whereas, yeah, in the Netherlands, then it's much more of a reliance on spatial planning rather than protected area management per se. And again, here we have a history of conflict between natural and cultural heritage. And I guess from a social science perspective, we've been trying to find the commonalities, the bridges between these different aspects, and trying to argue that actually nature in some ways is also cultural, that to really understand nature, we need to have a better understanding of the cultural dimension, how the natural landscape is perceived as well. And that in some ways, in front of the dikes, it is also a cultural landscape. It's not only a natural landscape, that we need to take into account the cultural history as well. That, yeah, in very concrete terms, there are drowned villages outside the dikes from the Middle Ages, places that have used to be inhabited, and then through catastrophic storm floods, they were essentially lost to the sea. And this memory, even though it is from maybe the 1300s, it's still relevant today for some people living on the coast. And they will say, well, actually, this is a drowned cultural landscape. This is, how dare you come here from outside and say this is pure nature, this is wilderness. It can't be wilderness if people lived here in the past. So these are some of the debates that you have, which are still ongoing as well. On Schiermonnikoog, one of the Dutch islands, which itself is a national park just on the island, there's quite a different approach, much more inclusive, that the national park should belong to everyone on the island, that it's about the connections between nature, ecology, economy, cultural history, recreation, and community, that all of this should be strengthened. So emphasizing these connections rather than the separation between nature and society. The national park there is weaker in legislative terms, in terms of what it can do, but it can be more effective in some ways in bringing stakeholders together and trying to develop a common vision. Okay, migratory birds. At the Wadden Sea as well, particularly at the trilateral level, where the three countries come together and coordinate their activities, there's a very strong focus on the East Atlantic Flyway and the role of the Wadden Sea in this context. And actually, at the time of the World Heritage Site designation, UNESCO asked the Wadden Sea to play a proactive role in capacity building along the East Atlantic Flyway. And currently, they've been very successful recently in with third-party funding for a number of projects to expand monitoring and also capacity building, particularly working with key sites in West Africa along the East Atlantic Flyway. So that's a key focus, both of the national parks and of the World Heritage Site at the international level as well. So this is really part of the story of the Wadden Sea and has been since the beginning, really similar to it in Donana in the 1960s and 1970s. It was this global dimension of migratory birds, these connections that led to the international efforts to try and protect these areas, these wetlands. So that is a key focus here in research terms as well, with various research institutes. And here it has been argued that the migratory birds bring into focus the global meaning of the Wadden Sea. They show these international connections, interdependencies, and help to tell stories of faraway places and other cultures. And the idea here is that through migratory birds, we can tell a very powerful story about how nature is connected globally, and not have just a local focus in the not dominant narrative about the Wadden Sea or another protected area, but also that this is a global story. And this is something that has been really emphasized as well in the Danish context, for example, here, but at the same time making it about local connections, about connections to the local place. This iconic image, for example, of starlings is known as the black sun in the Danish context at the town of Ribe at the Danish Wadden Sea coast. And here it was argued that the migratory birds was the biggest nature-telling story about the Wadden Sea, so we can see the global meaning of this area. And for this reason as well, the Danish National Park, the Wadden Sea National Park, is understood as their international national park. So there's a very strong emphasis on the international dimension, but at the same time recognizing that you needed to bring the birds near to the people to really understand and see the beauty of the Wadden Sea. And here as well in the interpretive center, the visitor center at the Danish Wadden Sea coast, they try and make the connection between people traveling as visitors and their experience of traveling with the experience of birds as visitors as well. And actually at the Wadden Sea, as far as I know, there are approximately 10 to 12 million avian visitors per year, and a similar number of human visitors as well. So it's around the same scale, the same level of magnitude. And there are some key initiatives across the Wadden Sea to really communicate the importance of the migratory birds in different ways. For example, on some of the really tiny German islands through a Brent Geese Festival, and also at a much larger scale, the Migratory Bird Days every October in Lower Saxony. And these are efforts, in Lower Saxony at the Migratory Bird Days. Each year they invite visitors from West Africa as well to really show and emphasize the cultural connections and build these links as well. So in my research, actually it was published in a book chapter in this book here that we published last year, is partly about the role of the migratory birds in through local place-based cultural practices in making these connections between the local and the global dimension of the protected area. This idea that for a protected area to be successful, it needs to always manage this tension between the local and the global and make it into a productive relationship, and that this, we can see this quite clearly at the Wadden Sea in relation to migratory birds. Okay, so in terms of where I am now, recently a cluster of excellence has been funded in Oldenburg, also with the university in cooperation with the Institute for Avian Research in Wilhelmshaven, and this is really very, very large-scale research. It's, I think, the largest that's really available in Germany through the German Research Foundation, and so we are very lucky to have this research. I'm one of the, I think, 2 social scientists involved, with altogether about 50 PIs maybe. So it's a very large consortium, mostly around the understanding the mechanisms behind animal migration. So not just birds, but also ants and various different species. There's also a strong quantum mechanics dimension, which I understand absolutely nothing about, among others. So it's very interdisciplinary. And yeah, we have at the university in Oldenburg, a strong focus on songbirds, and also then in Wilhelmshaven on terns as well, which is all connected then within this excellence cluster. From my point of view, it gives a strong basis for interdisciplinary collaboration, looking at some of the issues that I'm addressing here and connecting them then with the ornithological research as well. Yeah, so coming to Donana, I've recently found this quotation from Jan Carlos del Olmo from the WWF, that it doesn't make sense really to think about Donana without the people, that it's been shaped by people, and we can't, trying to change that is not the answer. So to me, this related to this idea about the role of protected areas in the Anthropocene. Yeah, this is just one image of from this week of my visiting the national park here, and the storks, of course, and the electricity masts as well. So what am I interested in here? Why am I here? So it's partly about the relationship between the national park and the regional hinterland. How in practice we connect conservation and sustainable development objectives. This is interesting partly because also at the Wadden Sea we have this combination of a national park, World Heritage Site, and a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve at a part of the Wadden Sea at least, so we have similar processes institutionally. Secondly then, about the relationship between local, regional and national and global values at Donana. So this, of course, Donana from the beginning has been very much international, but it also has a local meaning. It has a national meaning as well, in terms of its national park designation. Looking critically, I suppose, about around the UNESCO World Heritage designation and what it means currently for Donana and the status of being in danger. To what extent is it helpful that Donana is a World Heritage Site? What that means in practice. For me, that is interesting because also the Wadden Sea, as I mentioned, is the scrutiny there about. I don't think it's likely that it will not stay a World Heritage Site, but there's increased recognition of the anthropogenic pressures there as well. Another more applied aspect, I guess, is around the potential for greater cooperation across wetland sites in Europe and along the East Atlantic Flyway as well. So, in the short term, I'm primarily interested in the policy and literature analysis, trying to understand more the relationship between science and conservation ideology at the Wadden Sea. And I know that there have been critical discussions about this in relation to some of the IUCN and Ramsar expert assessments. Looking at a comparison with the Wadden Sea, and particularly around the management of park hinterland relations and what this means for the World Heritage status. And the third aspect is more looking towards future funding, future grant applications, to develop a comparative perspective across multiple wetland sites along the East Atlantic Flyway, first of all in Western Europe, but also potentially in West Africa as well. So some of the key big questions for me, social scientists like to ask big questions, doesn't necessarily mean they answer them. yeah, a key aspect here is whether we need more honest conservation narratives when we're thinking about conservation in the Anthropocene, that it's maybe not so much about primordial, intact, original wilderness. That I think often in the official policies we see a mix, a confusion between very normative statements about what ideally we would like to have and what we actually have in practice. So that's what I mean about more honest conservation, really critically asking what does it mean to have a World Heritage site, to say this is World Heritage in the Anthropocene context. Yeah, how can conservation narratives better build on local place-based values while also taking the international context into account? So the stories that we tell about nature through protected areas. And related to this, I guess, is the question of integrating protected area management with sustainable regeneration at the regional scale, because we know that many of the problems that need to be addressed are really outside the park boundaries. So this relationship, of course, is critical, and that's often where the focus needs to be, rather than on what happens within the park boundaries themselves. And finally, I guess it's a question of interdisciplinary integration, but perhaps we can better integrate nature meanings and values in conservation science as well. So not only looking at the human system, the social system in systemic terms, but also in terms of the meanings that are attributed to nature in different contexts. So I will leave it there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions you may have, and hopefully my talk has stimulated some discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this talk. Are there any questions from the audience?
Very interesting. I'm just wondering, it strikes me the contrast where you've got a very clear boundary when you talk about the Wadden Sea. And in terms of Donana, I think you need to think carefully about what boundaries or what boundary you really are referring to, because it's so complicated, the differences between national park, biological reserve, natural park, and then you've got the Man and Biosphere Reserve, which you haven't mentioned, which I think might be an interesting topic for your research, because honestly it's not clear to me what value that has at all. It's something we hardly talk about, whereas we do discuss the World Heritage Site, National Park all the time. So I think you just, be careful what you mean by defining what you mean by Donana, because it's many different things to different people, and that's not probably so complicated in the case of the Wadden Sea. And also, there is an initiative in terms of grey-lag geese, which is a bit similar to what you were talking about the Brent goose thing. So we're actually, I think Donana is part of a network project led by Jesper Madsen in Denmark, if I remember correctly, because of our importance for the migratory grey-lag goose population, although it's almost disappeared now, unfortunately, because of changes with global change, and that's useful to bear in mind. And I think also in terms of flyway initiatives, and of course you haven't mentioned the African and Eurasian waterbird agreement, which is absolutely fundamental, I think, in terms of flyway initiatives, but I think we could say that Spain's participation in that agreement is extremely disappointing and weak compared with other signatories to the Bonn Convention. And that's, I think, connected with our sort of decentralized system where conservation is very much run from the autonomous communities rather than from the federal government in Madrid. And so there's no effectively coordinated representation in the Iowa meetings typically, and so it's a real barrier to being fully involved in initiatives in terms of flyway conservation, in my experience.
Okay.
So I think that's something maybe we can talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Those insights. Yeah. In some ways, that's a similar issue in Germany, in that the national parks are at the federal state level, and there's relatively little happening at the federal level. So trying to find a coordinated, informed perspective, and yeah, those challenges are there also. Yeah, I think also with the Donana, the boundaries, yeah, that's certainly a key issue, and I have looked at the I can't remember the official names, the key policy documents for both the national park and the natural area as well, and trying to understand their perspectives, and yeah, it's yeah, there's a lot of discussion as well in the literature about whether fluid boundaries that are maybe less visible, if they are actually more beneficial, or whether we do need this more traditional approach of a very strong boundary between the national park and outside. And of course that's much easier at the Wadden Sea because it is the coastline. But yeah, it's partly the history there as well of that type of approach.
Any more questions or comments? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Really nice talk. So I was thinking, as scientists, we like and need to quantify effects. And so thinking about these conservation narratives and how to bring people closer to conservation, nature conservation, have you tried to quantify how people have a bearing on these conservation initiatives, and how policy in general is affected by social perceptions? And yeah, if we can quantify this, to include this in our research, which is, I think, really important right now if we want to establish effective conservation programs, let's say.
Yeah. The short answer is no. And I think it is very difficult to do that in a meaningful way. And of course there are attempts also at the Wadden Sea to develop decision support tools, and we are engaged in some of those processes, and to try in some way to bring social indicators into those. But for me, that's a very different question. And I think, yeah, so one way of doing interdisciplinary integration is to try and find data from the social sciences on social processes that fits then within natural science oriented models or research frameworks. The alternative, I would say, is at a more conceptual level, to try and find common ground or to find perspectives from the social sciences that can influence natural science understandings of how we think about nature as well. So for example, I have a paper at the moment comparing theories around human migration with theories around bird migration, and how, yeah, we understand from a human perspective issues around place attachment and how they might relate to site fidelity or these types of issues with birds. Yeah. we'll see if this paper gets published, because it's a really difficult one to find a journal that will actually understand both sides of it. But yes, at this more conceptual level, I think there really is potential there, particularly with increasing, with research very recently now in migration ecology, on animal culture, on social interaction, taking these aspects seriously, that there's more potential perhaps now for an interdisciplinary dialogue to move beyond a solely mechanistic understanding of bird navigation and migration to an approach that takes a wider range of aspects into account.
Thanks.
Any more questions or comments? Okay. If this is not the case, I would like to thank you once more for giving the seminar today. And next week we won't have a seminar, so I would like to make an announcement. I think we have a day or event organized by Jennifer and Victor. No? Okay. So
okay, so it's a discussion group thing, and it's actually the International Taxonomists Appreciation Day, and Victor is going to present a little bit about what EBD does for taxonomy and what taxonomy has done for EBD. So he's going to go over some of the type material that's in the collections and some of the taxonomy work being done by actual groups. That should be just really a few minutes, and then the idea is to have more of a discussion with pizza, and it'll be lovely and fun. You're all welcome. You don't need to read anything before going or know anything. Just come on.
So same time, same place. Okay, so I think there will be more information in the upcoming days, hopefully. Yeah, thank you very much for coming here.